This is where this case, I think, went wrong. I think the CPS shouldn't have referred this case for prosecution. I don't think the bar was met there, the realistic prospect of conviction. I don't think there was. And I think they should have sent it back and said, no, we're not going to prosecute.
Following the acquittal of Martyn Blake, the Met officer who killed Chris Kaba, the treatment of armed officers has come under the spotlight. Chris Kaba was shot in the head during an armed vehicle stop in 2022. The officer, Martyn Blake, has been cleared of murder. It can now be reported that Mr Kaba was in a notorious gang and was linked to 2 shooting incidents before his death. Questions are being asked about how the case ever got to trial. I'm Michael Simmons, and I'm joined by journalist and former advisor to Yvette Cooper, Danny Shaw. Martyn Blake has been cleared of murder, but it's reported that he's still likely to face gross misconduct charges within the police. Can you tell us a bit more about the case and explain why that is?
Well, Martyn Blake was cleared at the Old Bailey of murder. The jury took just 3 hours to clear him unanimously after a trial which looked extensively about the events on the night that Chris Kaba was shot and killed, going into great detail, microanalyzing all the footage and so on. But the criminal prosecution is separate from the police misconduct proceedings, because in the police misconduct case, it's a different level of proof, it's balance of probabilities, and also there are some different legal issues that have to be decided in a police misconduct case. So that's why there's a sort of separate process for that. I mean, there have been cases in the past in which officers have been acquitted of a particular crime, but it's found that they have breached their professional standards in some way, and they've been disciplined or they've been dismissed. So you can get those 2 separate decisions. In this case, I find it very, very hard to see how there would be a finding of gross misconduct against Martyn Blake, given the evidence that we've had in this trial and the fact that the jury has found him not guilty. I can't really see it. There were no issues around his conduct in any other way. There were no issues around the way the armed operation was carried out. No one's raised that. So it's baffling to me.
And is it even fair that there's this secondary process that Martyn Blake has to go through? I think many people would say that he's been cleared in a court of law by a jury. Shouldn't that just be good enough for the police?
Well, I mean, there are some cases in which a police officer is cleared of criminal charges, but they've still done something that's in breach of their professional standards as a police officer. And that's right that there are 2 separate processes. In this particular case, I just find it very, very hard to see how you can make a finding against him, although there is a sort of slightly different legal test around a finding, and also around the fact that, the moment that he fired the shot, the test was his honestly held belief that he was or his colleagues were in imminent risk of coming to harm. The test in disciplinary proceedings and civil proceedings around that is slightly different. It's quite technical. And so I suppose the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the police watchdog, could make a case to say, well, look, we've got this different test. We've got to use it to assess him in disciplinary proceedings. But I don't think it really is fair in this case. I have to be really honest, no.
And going into what, of course, was looked at in the trial and what this misconduct proceeding will look at, presumably the main piece of evidence is going to be that body cam footage. How have body cams changed policing in the UK? And would you say it's changed it for the better or for the worse?
I definitely think body cam footage has made a big difference since it was introduced a few years ago, because it provides, that almost unassailable video images of a particular incident. Of course, some of the footage is giving only one angle. Sometimes it's not switched on at the right moment. Sometimes it's a bit wobbly and a bit hazy, and that's certainly the case with this trial. But it gives you something that you never had before, which is the sort of the officer's sense of what he was seeing, what was in front of him or her. never had that before. You had to rely on people's witness statements and accounts. So of course it's an improvement. And I think the police really like it. They want to have body-worn cameras and they want to wear them because they used to get a lot of very mischievous, unfair complaints made against them. And then they can just now present the body-worn footage and say, there you go, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't insult this particular individual. I didn't assault them. And so I think it has worked in their favour.
Now, another piece of information that's come out since the verdict is more about the background of Chris Kaba, that he was a core member of a notorious gang and that he'd been involved in a shooting just days before this incident where he was killed. And this background about Chris Kaba has been raised as people have said, oh, if only this information was made public earlier, then maybe Martyn Blake wouldn't have gone through this trial. But what relevance is Chris Kaba's life to whether or not he should be shot by a police marksman?
Well, Chris Kaba's background and his appalling record of violence had no bearing whatsoever on this trial and on the decision that the jury had to make about Martyn Blake and whether Martyn Blake was justified in taking that shot. Because what Martyn Blake knew at that time, he didn't know who was driving the Audi car that the police were attempting to stop. He didn't know it was Chris Kaba in the car. So those details about Chris Kaba were completely irrelevant to that. However, it is right that the details have been revealed since the trial has finished because they give a rounded picture of Chris Kaba's character. We had rather a partial view. It was somehow suggested that he was this family man who worked in construction, and a slight image was painted where I think of an innocent individual who just happened to be driving along in a vehicle that the police are interested in, and this happened. That's not the case, as we now know. He was implicated in I think at least 2 shootings, one of which happened the night before, and one of which 6 days before. And he may well have had good reason to try to get away from police. I mean, the one thing you could say that was possibly relevant is that the material that we now know about him explains why he was so desperate not to be stopped by police and was trying to get away from them because of the events that he'd been caught up in.
Now, moving back to the investigation itself, it's clear that there's a confidence and a perception problem with police officers that they want to be backed up and supported ultimately by their employer and by the state. But equally, for people on the other side, Chris Kaba's family have pointed this out. There's been reports into the Met that have found the Met to be institutionally racist. Baroness Louise Casey has specifically pointed out a toxic culture within the firearms policing. Do you think that this side, this negative image of the police needs to be addressed if everybody is to have faith in investigating these incidents and if everyone's to accept the final outcome?
Look, there's no doubt about it that public trust in policing has taken a huge knock over the past few years with some appalling scandals in the Metropolitan Police in particular, with police officers who have been convicted of the most dreadful crimes. And there's also no doubt that black communities in London especially have the lowest levels of trust and confidence in the police. And there have been historical injustices involving black people at the hands of police. And so, it's a very delicate situation, which is why I think police were worried about the outcome of this trial and how that would play out. And it's also why they wanted the full background a bit about Chris Kaba to be known so that people understood that he was someone involved in gangs and violence and crime and not some sort of innocent guy just happened to be driving along. So there's a huge job of rebuilding public trust and confidence. But at the same time, the police have got to do their job and they've got to try and arrest dangerous people and stop firearms and seize firearms from the streets of London because it's a major problem. And they have to do that job. And, there are many members of the public in the black community that would want police to do that job as well. So it's a difficult balancing act, but I think the way that public trust and confidence is won is through the police doing their job every day and through every interaction, making that as good as it possibly can be, responding to reports of crime and investigating cases properly.
Now, on supporting police officers being able to do their jobs, Mark Rowley, Neil Basu have all today, called for change to how these things are investigated. And some people have even suggested that there should be some form of immunity in how the CPS look at police officers. Do you think the system needs to change to give armed police officers more protection to avoid prosecutions such as this?
I think the system does need to change, and the reforms that the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, with whom I worked before the election, is outlining, I think will go some way to addressing some of those concerns. I think there are several issues. One of them is around anonymity for police officers, for firearms officers who are caught up in cases like this. And I think some of those protections are going to be strengthened following the Home Secretary's announcement. And I think that's probably right on balance, although I do worry that it's very important that we don't restrict what the press can write in open court and what can be reported. That's very, very important. We have to watch that very carefully. But the other changes relate to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the watchdog. I think they need to speed up investigations. Some of the obstacles in the way of their investigations need to be removed. And there also needs to be a higher bar for them passing cases on to the Crown Prosecution Service. That threshold needs to be raised. And I think some of the changes that the Home Secretary is announcing will do that. And the third strand is the Crown Prosecution Service in particular. You see, I think this is where this case, I think, went wrong. I think the CPS shouldn't have referred this case for prosecution. I don't think the bar was met there, the realistic prospect of conviction. I don't think there was. And I think they should have sent it back and said, no, we're not going to prosecute. And I think the reason they didn't is because they don't have clear guidelines in cases like this involving highly specialised police officers working under the most immense strain and pressure, who don't go out to kill someone or cause someone serious harm, but in the line of duty, they have to take action in a split second to make a decision. And I think we need better guidelines for the Crown Prosecution Service to deal with these cases, to ensure that there's more of a filter before a case goes to court, to the Old Bailey. And I think that is what the Home Secretary has announced today, and I hope that will go some way to dealing with that.
And just picking up on your point that the Home Secretary is going to bring in further anonymity for officers that are prosecuted in this way. We talked earlier about some of the problems with this case is that the background of Chris Kaba weren't known for a long time. The body cam footage was not released for a long time for, obvious legal reasons. But if on the one hand we're saying access to this information would improve confidence earlier on, isn't more anonymity just going to make it worse?
I think you've got, it's a very good point. I'm not an advocate of anonymity. I want to see as few reporting restrictions as possible. As a journalist that's covered court cases, they're the bane of journalists' lives, reporting restrictions. And I think it's right that justice is seen to be done, that proceedings that take place in open court should be able to be reported with as few barriers as possible. So I think any measures that restrict the anonymity of police officers who are facing criminal proceedings should be as tightly drawn as possible and should be in the most exceptional circumstances. Perhaps we do need to move the dial just a little bit in their favour in this regard, but move it very, very slightly, because my fear is that if you get this wrong, you'll end up with other people who are facing trial, powerful people with access to very good lawyers who will say, well, my name needs to be kept out of the public domain. I'm in fear of my life. I'm seeking anonymity, and that would be a dangerous road to go down.
When this incident first occurred, and when the officer who fired the fatal shot was suspended and investigated, a lot of Met police officers put down their arms for a period and said they simply were not going to serve as armed police officers. Has that confidence been restored? Do you think the Home Secretary's measure announced today is going to restore that confidence?
I think there'll certainly be relief at the verdict, and that the jury came to its decision quickly, and that the restrictions on Chris Kaba's background have been lifted, so that can be reported. So there's more of a rounded picture. I think there'll be relief about that, and the way people have sort of supported Martyn Blake since the verdict and so on, and that will relieve some of the immediate pressure. But going forward, I think armed officers need to really feel that they have, the backing of the authorities behind them. I think the measures that Yvette Cooper's announced today will go some way. I'm not sure they're going to go the whole way, because I think there's still a sense that whether police use a gun or whether they use a taser or whether they arrest someone, handcuff someone, they're under scrutiny. Someone's filming them with an iPhone. It's going to be all over the internet, social media. Clips are going to be played out, and little snippets of that will be misconstrued. Now, that's something that's very hard to stop in terms of legislation. And that's clearly having some effect, I think, on eroding confidence.
Do you think on that specific point about clips that are shared and misconstrued, do you think the Met and other police forces have a better duty or a stronger duty to protect their own by essentially more of a counter PR operation? Not just in this instance. We've seen it in, for instance, policing protests where the police potentially has this footage, has this evidence where we could say, no, that we've been misconstrued here. You've not got the full picture. We're going to sort of take that narrative head on.
Look, I think police can absolutely improve the way they communicate with the public and explain things, particularly on social media. They've been very slow to adapt, in my view, and they need to get on the front foot. What people need a lot often is just an explanation of things. And sometimes it's an explanation of why the police can't say anything or why they can't say any more. So I think there's a real job for the police to do there. But make no mistake, dealing with social media and the dangers of conspiracy theories and untrue comment, swirling around is not something that the police can just deal with. This is probably something that governments need to tackle as well.
And just lastly, if you could imagine, if you were today a young trainee in the Met Police, would you consider a career as an armed officer, or would you think best to avoid that?
Look, it wouldn't be for me. I mean, there are certain bits of policing I would be attracted to, such as detective work and investigations. Being an armed officer, no, I wouldn't, because it's, the risks that you face. I mean, you've got to remember, it's so rare that an officer in this country uses their gun. I think in the last year, there were 17,000 armed operations by police in England and Wales, and only on 2 occasions was someone shot dead. I think there may be, slightly more times that police use the weapon, but on 2 out of 17,500 armed operations, it's very, very, very rare that officers use their guns, and even rarer that someone is killed. We have a very restrained armed police force in this country, thankfully. It wouldn't be a job for me, but if other people want to do it, they will get superb training, and they're doing a job that all of us should be grateful for.
Thanks, Danny, and thank you for watching Spectator TV.
Thank you very much.